The hall was vast, a towering structure of polished obsidian and pulsing blue light. Thousands of Vashtari filled the seats, their bioluminescent skin casting an eerie glow over the proceedings. Their elongated fingers tapped impatiently on the smooth, curved surfaces of their benches as the high judge took his place. At the center of the chamber, bound in intricate energy restraints, stood Serena Carter. She had been stripped of her weapons, her body bruised from the brutal interrogation that had preceded this so-called trial. Despite it all, her posture remained straight, defiant. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth, but she ignored it. Her dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the sneering faces of her captors. Overlord Zekvar stood, his imposing figure draped in ceremonial armor, his voice amplified by unseen technology. "Human," he spat, as if the word itself was an insult. "You have violated the sanctity of Vashtari territory. You have spilled the blood of our warriors. You stand here guilty of crimes against the Empire." Serena remained silent. Zekvar's lips curled. Nothing to say? No plea for mercy? A slow smile spread across Serena's face, cracked lips parting just enough to show teeth. Would it matter? A murmur rippled through the assembled Vashtari. Zekvar's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the staff in his hand tightened. No, it would not. The chamber's massive display activated, broadcasting a recording of Serena's ship breaching Vashtari borders. Then, footage of a dead Vashtari soldier, his throat slit with brutal precision. "You killed one of our own. He killed my team first. You were trespassing. You invaded our colony first." Zekvar's expression darkened, but he did not argue. "You humans are reckless, short-lived. You think your actions matter in the grand scheme of the cosmos." He gestured toward the audience. "We are eternal. We do not break. We do not fear." His voice dropped, smooth and sharp. "And now, we will demonstrate what happens when your kind crosses us." The execution platform activated beneath Serena's feet. Metal restraints clamped around her wrists and ankles, lifting her effortlessly into the air. Thin cables extended from the ceiling, wrapping around her limbs in a cruel mockery of reverence. A figure approached, a Vashtari executor, clad in ceremonial robes, holding a gleaming instrument. The first device pressed against her temple, sending white-hot agony through her skull. Serena's jaw clenched, breath hissing between her teeth, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a scream. The second was a chemical injector, plunging into her neck. Her muscles seized. Fire coursed through her veins, igniting every nerve in her body. The Vashtari murmured in approval. Her breathing grew ragged. Her fingers twitched. The pain was indescribable, something beyond natural comprehension. Still, she did not scream. Minutes passed, then an hour. The torment continued, shifting between psychic bombardments, electrostatic surges, and precise incisions meant to test human thresholds of agony. And still she did not break. A flicker of unease spread among the audience. "Curious," one scientist murmured. "Her pain tolerance is higher than recorded human limits." Zekvar dismissed the comment. "It doesn't matter. Her body has limits." Indeed it did. Her breathing grew weaker. Her heartbeat slowed. She sagged in the restraints, vision blurring as her body finally gave in. Then silence. A single tone echoed from a hidden monitor. "Flatline." Overlord Zekvar rose. "It is done." A satisfied murmur swept through the chamber. The Vashtari were nothing if not appreciative of a good display. Serena Carter, the defiant human, was no more. Her body remained suspended, limp, lifeless. The executors deactivated the restraints, and she dropped unceremoniously onto the cold metal platform. The high judge turned toward the audience, his voice carrying over the hall. "Let this be a lesson to all humanity is weak. Their arrogance is their downfall. They do not belong among the stars." The gathered Vashtari rose in unison, their voices echoing in agreement. The execution had served its purpose. The message was clear. Serena Carter was dead. And then, 37 minutes later, she moved. A single breath. Shallow. Then deeper. Then another. Her fingers twitched against the metal surface. Her body, broken, bruised, should have remained still. But it didn't. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A scientist dropped his data tablet. Overlord Zekvar froze. Serena's chest rose. Fell. Rose again. The silence in the chamber was deafening. A whisper broke it. A Vashtari noble, trembling, murmured, This is impossible." Her body convulsed. Then, like a marionette pulled upright by unseen strings, she sat up. Her head lolled for a moment before snapping upright, dark eyes now burning with something other. Something wrong. Zekvar's hand clenched around the armrest of his throne. "Restrain her." Two executors rushed forward. Serena turned her gaze toward them. They hesitated. She smiled. And then she stood. The room recoiled as she took her first step forward. Her wounds were still visible, deep cuts and bruises marking her arms and legs. But they were healing. Actively. The process was slow but visible. Flesh knitting itself back together. One of the executors lifted his weapon. Serena tilted her head. He fired. The energy bolt hit her square in the chest. She staggered just for a moment. Then, impossibly, she straightened. The wound had already sealed. A murmur of horror spread through the Vashtari. Zekvar stood, towering over the assembly. "What trick is this?" Serena's voice was calm, steady. "Wrong. No trick." The chamber seemed to darken. "You wanted to see the limits of human endurance." Her hand clenched into a fist. Her smile widened. "Now let me show you what happens when we break them." The silence in the chamber stretched, thick with disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they were witnessing pressed down on them like a physical force. Serena took another step. The Vashtari executioners, elite warriors trained in subjugation, stood frozen. Their entire species had never encountered anything like this. Resurrection was not a concept in their understanding of biology. Death was final. Death was absolute. And yet, here she was. Serena rolled her shoulders, her limbs adjusting as if shaking off the remnants of another existence. Her dark eyes flicked toward the massive timer on the chamber wall. 37 minutes since her heart had stopped. Then she turned her gaze to the High Judge. Zekvar remained motionless, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne. His mind worked through 1,000 explanations. Glitches in their monitoring system, a biological anomaly, a ruse. None of them fit. A soldier to his right moved first, breaking the paralysis gripping the room. He leveled a weapon at her chest. "On your knees." His voice was strained. Serena tilted her head, considering the command. Then, slowly, she raised her hands. Every Vashtari in the room exhaled. A sense of control reasserted itself. The soldier stepped forward to secure her. Serena struck. She was fast before, efficient, deadly. But now she moved faster than their eyes could track. The soldier didn't have time to react. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, and with a casual flick, his bones snapped like dry twigs. He let out a strangled gasp as she wrenched the weapon from his grasp. The next guard lunged. She sidestepped smoothly, driving an elbow into his throat. He collapsed, choking. Two more charged. She caught the first by the shoulder and drove her knee into his gut with such force that his armor cracked. The second swung a blade toward her throat. Serena caught it with her bare hand. For a moment, they both stared at the impossible sight. The blade embedded in her palm, blood welling, but no sign of pain. Then she yanked it free and drove it into his chest. The chamber erupted into chaos. Zekvar roared for his forces to subdue her, but something primal, something instinctual, was creeping into his tone. The murmurs among the nobles shifted from confusion to fear. Serena turned toward the closest group of Vashtari scientists, who had been watching the execution unfold with clinical detachment. Now, their expressions were anything but detached. "You should be taking notes," she said, her voice light. "Isn't this what you wanted? Data?" One of them, Dr. Isser, swallowed hard. "Why, you were dead. You shouldn't." This isn't possible. Serena studied her palm. The wound was already closing. And yet, a scientist next to him hissed under his breath. She's evolving. Dr. Isser's eyes widened. No, this isn't evolution. This is something else. Serena took another step toward them and they stumbled back. Behind her, more Vashtari warriors poured into the chamber, their weapons raised. The air filled with the high-pitched hum of energy rifles being primed. Serena didn't turn. You can try, she murmured. But I don't think it'll go the way you want it to. Zekvar had heard enough. His voice boomed across the chamber. End this. A wall of energy bolts shot toward her. The room flashed as the beams struck her body. The force should have torn her apart. The sheer concentrated power of Vashtari weaponry was designed to disintegrate lesser species. Serena staggered under the barrage, her body jerking with every impact. Smoke curled from her wounds. And then, she exhaled. The Vashtari soldiers stopped firing. The smoke cleared. She was still standing. The wounds that had been burned into her flesh were already closing, fresh skin forming over scorched muscle. Her breathing steadied. She smiled. A Vashtari soldier dropped his rifle. It clattered against the chamber floor, the sound deafening in the sudden quiet. Serena stretched her neck, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off an inconvenience. Then she stepped forward again. Zekvar rose sharply. Hold your ground. No one moved. Not even the elites. Because this was no longer a battle. This was something else. Something they didn't understand. Something they feared. Serena took her time, her bare feet silent against the floor as she approached the execution platform where she had died. She ran a hand along its surface, where her body had lain, where she had been ended. She looked up at Zekvar, at the nobles, at the gathered Vashtari who had cheered her suffering. I remember everything, she said softly. A shudder passed through the room. Dr. Isser inhaled sharply. He turned to the High Judge, voice urgent. We need to study her. We need to understand. Zekvar cut him off. No, she's an abomination. Serena smiled, but it wasn't friendly. You're afraid, she murmured. Zekvar slammed his staff against the ground. I fear nothing, but his voice betrayed him. Serena met his gaze, unblinking. You should. The room held its breath. Thousands of Vashtari, the rulers of systems, the conquerors of lesser species, watched in stunned silence. Their belief in their own supremacy wavered, cracking like fragile glass beneath the weight of something they could not explain. Serena stepped forward. Not hurried, not aggressive, just moving, each footfall sending a ripple of unease through the chamber. The guards had stopped shooting. What was the point? The wounds they inflicted sealed as quickly as they were made. The weapons in their hands felt useless now, like relics of an age that had just ended before their very eyes. The scientists were still whispering, frantically recalculating their understanding of biology, of physics, of life itself. Zekvar saw the fear, the hesitation, and he despised it. His people, his empire were not cowards, but his grip on power had always been built on certainty. And now certainty had abandoned him. Do something, he snarled at the nearest officer. The soldier hesitated, then lunged at Serena with a blade, abandoning technology for something primal, something desperate. Serena caught his wrist mid-swing. She didn't even look at him. A slow, almost bored squeeze. Bone snapped. The soldier dropped, clutching his ruined arm, eyes wide with agony. She let him fall. Another warrior came at her from behind, a dagger flashing. She turned, grabbed him by the throat, and lifted him off the ground. His fingers clawed at her grip, his legs kicking uselessly in the air. Serena studied him, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to understand the fear in his eyes. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she hurled him across the chamber. His body crashed into a row of nobles, sending them scattering. The panic broke. Some of the Vashtari fled, abandoning dignity in favor of survival. Others remained frozen, unable to process what was happening. Zekvar stood his ground. Barely. Serena turned back to him. You wanted to make a statement. she said, voice calm. So did I. Her eyes flicked to the execution platform. Yours was about power. She stepped onto it, standing where she had died. Mine is about consequence. Zekvar's jaw tightened. You think this changes anything? Serena gestured to the crowd. It already has. The Vashtari nobles were no longer looking at their leader for guidance. They were looking at her, some with fear, some with awe, and Zekvar knew this was the real danger. It wasn't just that she had survived. It was that she had taken something from him. Control, authority, the myth of Vashtari invincibility. Serena exhaled, rolling her shoulders, her body still adjusting to whatever had changed within her. She didn't know how or why she had come back. Not yet, but she knew what it meant. It meant that they had no idea what humanity was capable of. And that terrified them more than anything. Zekvar's grip tightened around his staff. His authority, once unquestionable, now teetered on the edge of collapse. The murmurs in the chamber were no longer ones of certainty but of hesitation, uncertainty, fear. Serena had done nothing but stand there. Yet the foundation of Vashtari dominance had cracked beneath her feet. He couldn't allow it. Kill her, he commanded. His voice was sharp, but there was something beneath it. Something no Vashtari leader had ever shown before. Doubt. No one moved. The guards who had fired on her once wouldn't raise their weapons again. The scientists who had studied her execution now only studied her survival. The nobles who had once cheered for her death now watched in stunned silence, as if afraid to make themselves known. Serena took another step. You already tried, she said. It didn't work. Her voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't arrogant. It was simply a fact. One that everyone in the room had to accept. Zekvar bared his teeth. There is no force in the universe that can defy us. Serena held up her hand, showing the fresh pink skin where a wound had once been. Then why am I still here? The chamber seemed to shrink around him. His people, his empire, looked to him for answers, for a command, for certainty. And for the first time in his life he had none. Serena studied him. You should have made sure I stayed dead. He moved before he could think, drawing his blade in a flash of silver. Faster than a thought, faster than instinct, faster than anything he had ever done. The tip of the blade stopped against her throat. She didn't flinch, didn't react, just looked at him, unbothered, unshaken. He felt the cold weight of realization settle in his chest. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. Maybe she never was. Serena exhaled, stepping forward, pressing her throat against the blade, daring him, challenging him. For the first time, Zekvar hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything changed. Serena leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not the one in control anymore. The blade shook in his grasp. And then, in front of everyone, the High Judge of the Vashtari Empire lowered his weapon.